My name is Dan Rundy, and I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS, and I direct the Project on Prosperity and Development, and I lead the Americas program at CSIS. I'm really looking forward today to today's event on lessons learned from the El Salvador peace process for Afghanistan. We hope that this event will highlight important lessons from El Salvador's peace process in order to provide insight into the ongoing Afghan peace talks. Let me stress that a complete and sudden U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan would be a recipe for disaster. And Afghanistan has made dramatic political, social, and economic progress over the last 20 years, with mainly because of Afghanistan and the Afghans themselves, but the United States and our allies have helped. And the consequences of a hasty withdrawal have not been properly considered. But peace is possible, and there are ongoing peace talks now around the future of Afghanistan. And the Afghan government asked us to help them look at other lessons learned from other countries. And they asked CSIS to look specifically at the peace process and the experience of El Salvador. I'm really, really grateful to Linnea Sandin and Shannon McKeown, who are two really able scholars at CSIS. They put a ton of work into this, put together a fabulous brief. I'm really grateful to our two interns, Mary Sturgis and Elena Mendez-Leal, for supporting them. I'm particularly grateful to my friend, Dr. Juan Jose Daboob, who's a senior advisor here at CSIS. Dr. Daboob has taught me that not only is peace possible in a place like El Salvador, but prosperity is possible. And he led some incredible progress in El Salvador after peace was achieved. So I think we need to think beyond today's present moment in Afghanistan. Prosperity is also possible in Afghanistan, just as there was peace and prosperity possible in El Salvador. So thank you, Dr. Daboob. I'm also grateful to Dr. Diana Negroponte for her terrific book on the El Salvador peace process and for taking time to speak with us. I'm really grateful to the Afghan Embassy for entrusting us with this great work. This is part of their Lessons in Peace series. There's several big lessons we've taken away from this experience. We probably interviewed about 15 people. We read Dr. Negroponte's book, and my colleagues worked really hard and read everything there is on the El Salvador peace process and interviewed many really thoughtful people, affiliates of CSIS, people like Annie Forsheimer. We talked to Mark Schneider, who's a senior advisor at CSIS, knows a lot about it. We also were very fortunate to talk to Ambassador McKinley, who had a lot to say. Just some really smart people. But there were some really big takeaways. A third-party mediator is likely going to be essential to concluding a peace pact in Afghanistan, like the UN was for El Salvador. We're really lucky to have Ambassador De Soto with us, who was that mediator, to talk about that. International support and verification are likely to be required for what's called demobilization, disarmament, and security sector restructuring. In addition, peace agreements should emphasize ample and sustained opportunities for ex-combatants to participate in an expanding economy. Fourth, international financing to facilitate this effort should be available for at least a decade. This is something my friend, the late John Sambrelo, taught me, is that after the peace was achieved in El Salvador, that the United States, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, all, and the European Union and others had to be there to support El Salvador. What if John Sambrelo was here today, he would say is that if we get a peace deal in Afghanistan, we're going to have to make a big push. The Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the United States, Japan, Canada, the European Union, we're all going to have to continue to support the Afghan government. I'm really pleased to have such an esteemed panel of experts to be with us. We have my friend and someone I really admire, Ambassador Ann Patterson. She was an American diplomat, a career foreign service officer, served a number of roles in the State Department. She had many roles. She was ambassador to El Salvador in the 90s. She also had worked on the Afghanistan issues when she was Assistant Secretary in the 2000s as well. So she knows El Salvador and she knows Afghanistan. Really grateful to have Ambassador De Soto, who worked for the United Nations for 25 years as the former UN Secretary General's representative for the El Salvador peace negotiations. I'm very grateful to have Ambassador Ruben Zamora, who's the former El Salvador ambassador to the United Nations. We have, he was also Salvador ambassador to the United States, but I'd also like to recognize General Mauricio Chato Vargas, who is a congressman from the Arena Party representing San Salvador, and retired military general. And we also have, to make some opening remarks, my very good friend, Ambassador Rahmani from the Afghan Embassy, to help frame this all up. I've got a few housekeeping comments, and then I'll turn the floor over to Ambassador Rahmani. This event is available in both English and Spanish. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a globe icon. So after the record, you know, those different icons on Zoom, or I think it's Zoom, there'll be a globe icon. You click on that if you want to hear this in English or Spanish. We have a English to Spanish translator and a Spanish to English translator. Later, recordings of both the English and the Spanish versions will be available on the CSIS YouTube page in the coming days. Time permitting, we will have an audience Q&A portion at the end of this discussion. So please feel to submit your questions using the link on the event webpage on csis.org. Let me just say one other thing. I feel very, very strongly about this topic. I care a lot about the future of Afghanistan. I really appreciate the Afghan Embassy entrusting us with this work. I think the stakes are really high. We cannot let go of Afghanistan. We need to be a friend to Afghanistan. And I think this is one way we can contribute to help the Afghan people. They've made tremendous progress. It's immoral for us to pull the plug. It's important for us to be a reliable partner. So Ambassador Rahmani, thank you so much for being here. Let me turn over to you to make some general remarks, and then we'll have a moderated conversation. Ambassador Rahmani, what a privilege and an honor to have you. Please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Randy. As I mentioned before, the commitment of people like yourself gives us more energy to keep on pressing and going. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on wherever you are joining us for this session. Assalamu alaikum, may peace be upon you. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the third event in the Embassy of Afghanistan's ongoing Lessons in Peace series. We have already learned so much from our past two sessions on Colombia with U.S. Institute of Peace and Lebanon with the Atlantic Council. Today, we look to El Salvador's peace process in order to better understand the lessons it can provide. We are delighted to be hosting today's event with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I sincerely thank CSIS, especially the wonderful Dan Rundy, my dear friend, for steering us through this conversation, and the Project on Prosperity and Development for helping to organize this important discussion. Ambassador Ann Patterson, Ambassador De Soto, General Chato Vargas, and Ambassador Zamaro, thank you all for generously taking the time to share your insights and perspectives with us. Of course, the Afghan peace process and the Salvadorian peace process happens in pretty different contexts. But there are some things that I know our people have in common: a deep desire for peace and an unwavering hope for a better future. Despite the fact that many nations share these qualities, 50% of peace negotiations usually fail. So what distinguishes successful negotiations? One of the key missing factors in failed negotiations is often the commitment to making peace a reality. But what does commitment mean? For Afghanistan, commitment means making sure we take the time to get this right and build a truly durable peace. We have waited 40 years for peace. Now, generations of Afghan have known nothing but conflict in their lifetimes. We can be patient with the process in order to ensure no more lives will be marred by war. This means not just talking about a deal and a political settlement, but also about life after. Post-peace plans need to be made, centering on a shared vision for development. Much of what my friend Mr. Rundy was talking about. A holistic approach is needed where peace is achieved by focusing on the state, the market, and the peace building all together. And commitment means inclusivity of women, youth, and minorities. There have been too many victims of war. There cannot be any victims of peace we forge. Our peace simply will not succeed. But we don't just need commitment on our side. We need commitment from our international partners. Again, as Mr. Rudy was referring to. Our partners need to commit to continue to support all the institutions and the gains that we have worked on so hard and we have achieved together over the past 2 decades. And we need commitment from our regional partners that they will also work with us to promote regional economic development for their own stability and prosperity and for ours. But most importantly, we need commitment to peace from those sitting across the negotiation tables from us. There has to be true commitment on both sides. We know we are committed. We hope the Taliban are too. And that very soon we may see a significant decrease in violence or a ceasefire as a demonstration of that. We see El Salvador's commitment to pursuing peace each and every day. And I know that Afghans can do the same. When I reflect on my people, one thing that stands out to me the most is their indomitable spirit and eternal willingness to press on. I see a brave nation where the population and economy have been ravaged by war, yet they continue to innovate and find ways to heal themselves and the economy. I see a beautiful land scarred by bombs and bullets, where flowers grow between the cracks and roads are paved over battlefields. We dream for a better future, where Afghanistan is a land bridge through Central Asia, South Asia, and Middle East, and serves as the heart of the world, and where Afghans do not live or continue to live in fear. Having a vision for the future is essential, but I have heard it said that nothing comes to a sleeper but a dream. This is why we are here today, to learn from this distinguished panel. We are here to learn how to turn our dream into a reality. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rahmani. I'm so inspired. Thank you for entrusting us with this. Let me turn to the panel. Thank you again. So I want to start with my friend, Ambassador Patterson, who knows Afghanistan well. So Ambassador Patterson, let me turn to you and ask you to make some remarks as part of this panel, and then we'll turn to some of the others. Ambassador Patterson.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And it's so great to see friends from El Salvador, and thank you, Madam Ambassador. I'm thrilled to be here. My family and I loved El Salvador, and it's always be grateful for the friendship that we were shown there. I arrived about 6 years after the peace process, and so I have a different perspective on what was going well and what wasn't. And of course, I've been to Afghanistan a number of times, but don't pretend to know it as well. And let me say first that I thank El Salvador for all the problems that it has now. It's had 30 years of democratic rule and alternating political parties. That's a success by any standard. I thought your paper was excellent, really outlined the issues very well, but I'm going to speak from my experience as a practicing diplomat. First, I think the UN provided an absolutely first-string team to support the peace process. I know Mr. De Soto is going to speak next, but also as a former mayor of Bogota, Augusto Ramirez Ocampo, and just as important, in my view, very strong heads of the UN agencies like UNDP. The UN has about 10 incredibly able people who have moved from assignment to assignment, who can pick up the phone and call any foreign minister in the world on a moment's notice. And that's the sort of person you need to have for Afghanistan. After El Salvador, I went on to other senior positions, including the deputy position in New York, but I never quite saw the coherence or the skill of the team that I had seen in El Salvador. So Madam Ambassador, your first step has to ensure that you get an absolutely first-string international team there to help you with the peace process. By 1997, it was pretty obvious that political integration was working well, but the real problem, in my view, was economic opportunities for the previous fighters. And at the embassy, we used to say that reconciliation had worked really well in criminal gangs because ex-guerrillas had teamed up with ex-members of the military for criminal activity. The problem was lack of jobs. And even though the World Bank and the US had aggressively promoted land reform and vocational training, there simply weren't enough opportunities to absorb men and some women who had been involved in the war. This was eased somewhat by migration to the US, which had its own problems, which perhaps we can discuss. There were really important issues at economic reform. Dan, you mentioned one, Jose Dabub, but job generation just didn't keep pace. And I suspect this is going to be a major problem in Afghanistan too. And then by the time I got there, criminal violence was quite high. And I think the international community, I think other panelists may disagree with this, made a mistake in focusing on the police in sort of a DDR aspect instead of as a competent police force. And the police never really kept up, in my view, with the violence and challenges of the country. And I think if we could look back and do it over again, that would be one of the things we would look at. So I've got three sort of procedural things I want to raise with the ambassador. Afghanistan's going to need foreign investment, and they're going to need lots of it. And one of the huge problems in El Salvador was its reputation for violence. It was enormously difficult to overcome. It was very hard to persuade Westerners that it wasn't a country still in civil war. I think this will be true in spades in Afghanistan because of the longest war in US history and sayings like that. So you're going to have to work very hard, Madam Ambassador, to redress this view in the West and in Western embassies and in other places. It's going to put a huge burden on your government, I think, to explain to Chamber of Commerce and talk shows in the Midwest that this is no longer true. My second procedural observation is that the embassies, the NGOs, the international agencies, and need to find new people. What I found during 6 years later is if you had been there during the war, it was very difficult to deal with the FMLN who were still perceived as the enemy. So I think this will be true of the Taliban. So you're going to need some new faces and not just people that have experience over the 20-year war in El Salvador. And if you can't shake hands with someone who's got blood on their hands, you're probably in the wrong business. And my third observation, Madam Ambassador, is about the money. I left Pakistan in 2010. The US government was spending $10 billion a month in Afghanistan, mostly on the military presence, of course, but this is going to put a huge burden on the Afghan government and its friends to, as Dan said, sustain the funding levels because it's going to be cheap in comparison with what the Western countries have spent on military operations. I think you'll find a largely sympathetic audience, at least in the US, because people want to preserve the advances that have been made, and particularly vis-a-vis the advances for women and girls. And nobody wants to see it turn up with another Al-Qaeda-like group. But that brings me back to where I started. You're going to need a really first-rate international team to help you do all this and to pull all these strands together. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador Patterson. Let me turn to Ambassador De Soto, please. Ambassador De Soto.
Yes, thank you very much, Dan, and hello to everyone. This is the opportunity to make some general remarks. Am I right, Dan? The UN, for the first time ever, entered a mediation of an internal conflict in El Salvador. And there are a certain number of things that we learned quickly that distinguish mediating an international conflict and an internal conflict. And one of them is that the character of the conflict tends to be fratricidal in nature, and that it creates a level of distrust that doesn't necessarily arise amongst states between whom there are rules that one assumes can apply. One of them being that you can't just send the army or an invading army back into its own territory, because of course all the combatants are already in their own territories. Another one is that for that same reason, it's more difficult to get a ceasefire because at least one of the parties, and this was the case in El Salvador, insisted that it would not engage in a ceasefire until a certain number of political agreements were achieved. And so these turned out to be wartime negotiations. Now that put pressure on the parties, and it kept the attention of the Security Council focused on the conflict, which was not necessarily a bad thing. But of course, it meant that you were unable to get a quick relief from the violence for the people who had already suffered from 10 years of war. A second consideration is that the level of distrust in El Salvador, distrust and suspicion on the part of representatives of conflicting parties who were at each other's throats, not just yesterday, but at that very moment, was extremely high. And it made it very difficult for them to take seriously the proposals that one side or the other may have be hearing in the course of conversations. For instance, I will give you one example without necessarily naming names, where one of the two sides made a proposal at the negotiating table, face to face with the other side, that the other side simply ignored. And I pointed this out to them after the meeting, and I said, that proposal was interesting. You should have picked it up. And the response was, if they made that proposal, there must be some nefarious reason behind their making it. That is the level of distrust where you can't saying yes is extremely difficult. And for that reason, you need a third party. There's no other way of getting around it. And we found ourselves in the not necessarily enviable position of having to be the ones who held the pen, as it were, who had to make suggestions to them in order to find ways out where we thought that they might be viable. And it turned out that very little business was transacted face to face. It was essentially the proposals that came out and the formulas that eventually were agreed to were the result of parallel or at least separate consultations between the mediating team and the parties separately in order to forge something that in an international conflict perhaps might have been resolved amongst professionals in a dispassionate way. Now, I know that you have plenty on your plate, so I think I'll just keep my general remarks there to that.
Thanks, Ambassador. Let me turn to Ambassador Zamora. Embajador Zamora, usted.
A todos y decía que yo quisiera plantear nada más 3 cosas por el tiempo que tengo como experiencias que yo aprendí. Bueno, primero que es un proceso y que requiere tiempo y que no es la negociación todo. Al contrario, yo creo que es un proceso que empieza con tratar de romper la imposibilidad de la negociación. Y la imposibilidad no solo en los actores fundamentales, que son los dos bloques que están pues disparándose el uno al otro, sino en la población y en los élites del país. Nosotros empezamos a hablar de solución política negociada a 2 o 3 meses después de que el FMLN lanzó su principal iniciativa. Y lo que primero encontrábamos era incredibilidad. Es imposible que los coroneles con los guerrilleros, con los comandantes, se sienten a la mesa a no ser para tirarse tiros. Eso era la respuesta. Gradualmente en la sociedad salvadoreña se fue creando esa posibilidad, o sea, romper la imposibilidad de la negociación. Y esto es lo que en los Estados Unidos, ese dicho que dice, ¿verdad? Que negotiations are always the second best alternative. Porque solo hasta cuando los dos combatientes se dan cuenta de que o pueden ir a perder completamente la guerra, pueden tomar y empezar a tomar la alternativa de la negociación. Eso es una ley que yo la aprendí allí. La segunda, ¿verdad? Es que tener claro que toda negociación política de esta cantidad no es un contrato de comercial, sino que trata con una sociedad entera y una nación, tiene límites de contenido y de texto. Límites de contenido en el sentido que por lo general estas negociaciones tienden a descartar raíces del conflicto. En el caso nuestro es muy claro. Las negociaciones se centraron por 2 años, ¿verdad?, en cuestiones de la política y reestructurar o empezar a estructurar una democracia y desmilitarizar la política del país. Tuvieron éxito en eso, claramente. Pero lo social, lo cultural, que son parte de las raíces de la violencia en el país, prácticamente no los pudo tocar porque no había condiciones de correlación de fuerza entre los dos bandos como para poder lograr acuerdos en torno a eso. Únicamente se dieron unas luces, decir, bueno, continúan después haciendo esto, que no funcionaron en absoluto. Creo que esto es importante. Y la tercera, lección que aprendí es que la polarización de la que parte un conflicto armado como el nuestro y con una historia de polarización política de más de, qué sé yo, de 50 años en la época presente en que el gobierno estaba dominado por el aparato militar, por la institución militar. Después de esa polarización, la necesidad de fuerzas externas es indispensable. No estoy hablando de fuerzas militares, sino de fuerzas políticas, o sea, de la comunidad. En ese sentido, ¿verdad? Yo creo que hay tres pasos, me veo en el caso salvadoreño de esto. El primero, que yo le llamo la fase gradual, que es contribuir a que la sociedad acepte la necesidad de una solución política. Aquí la sociedad civil salvadoreña jugó un papel determinante, pero también internacionalmente los demás países de Centroamérica, por ejemplo, tomaron acuerdos sobre la necesidad de buscar soluciones políticas y gradualmente el Congreso de Estados Unidos, la Unión Europea, otros países de América Latina, todos empezaron a manejar la necesidad de la solución política y eso ayudó tremendamente, creo yo, para que se creara en el país la base social para una cosa que antes era inconcebible, ¿verdad? Entonces esa primera etapa gradual se dio en el caso nuestro y creo que fue muy exitosa. Siguió la etapa pues que podemos llamar de la negociación propiamente hablando, que creo yo que fue con los límites que se había establecido, creo que ella ha sido una de las más exitosas que han habido. Pero de ahí viene una tercera etapa de cooperación que es necesaria, que a mi juicio es la que yo llamo la etapa del resguardo. O sea, la participación de actores externos dentro de la negociación, no en la mesa de la negociación, porque ahí lo mejor es que no estén, y que quien esté sea una institución con la mayor posibilidad de neutralidad en un conflicto interno, como es, por ejemplo, las Naciones Unidas. Tan es así que cuando fue el caso nuestro, el gobierno quería la OEA, la guerrilla no quería la OEA y Naciones Unidas, y se terminó con Naciones Unidas y creo que fue lo más correcto en este caso. ¿Por qué? Porque es la más multinacional de todas las instituciones y además porque tiene experiencia profesional en estos casos. O sea que en ese sentido, allí fue correcto, pero luego vino el resguardo. La cooperación internacional tiende a retirarse de las cosas que ha resuelto. Y esto es muy grave. Naciones Unidas se retiró antes de tiempo de lo que debería ser. Y esto el embajador, que era el que hizo todo el proceso de mediación al final. Pero durante todo el mayor proceso de Álvaro fue un proceso de facilitar que las partes negociaran y que lograran negociar racionalmente. Y solo es en el último acuerdo, el de Nueva York, en que el secretario general le da a Álvaro la autoridad de ser mediador, es decir, de poner una propuesta y decir, esto es lo que hay que hacer, ¿ya? Que es la gran diferencia entre facilitador y negociador. Lo hizo cuando ya estaba maduro y se hizo correctamente porque ahí fue donde se resolvió el problema, con mucha ayuda internacional. ¿Ya? Le pueden preguntar al presidente Cristiani, le pueden preguntar al expresidente de los Estados Unidos, ¿verdad? De la famosa cena que hubo, donde se resolvió lo que era una cosa que parecía que no se podía resolver entre ellos. Todo eso hay que hacerlo. Era necesario, pero no irse tan temprano y no saber cómo resguardar los acuerdos de paz. ¿Por qué? Porque la gran lección que tenemos es que 30 años después de esos acuerdos, lo que estamos peleando es porque no se nos hagan retroceder. No por avanzar, sino porque simplemente no retrocede el país en los logros que tuvo en la solución política. Eso pues las tres cosas que yo quería decir de lección. Hay más, ¿verdad? Fue una gran escuela, pero como hay 5 minutos ya me pasé.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a volver a usted. Muchas gracias, embajador. General Vargas, por favor, usted tiene la palabra. También usted está muteado, general. Tóquese el mute button, tóquese el botón, general. Está.
Ok, ¿me escucha ahora?
Sí, sí.
¿Me escucha ahora?
Sí, señor.
No puede verse como un acto, puede verse como un acto único. Esto fue una reflexión bastante grande de poner las piezas en el rompecabezas de la paz que había sido tan evasivo por muchos años. Solamente contestándonos esas interrogantes logramos la posibilidad de caminar hacia la paz. Es bien claro para mí que el esclarecimiento lo da el propio conflicto, porque es este el que aclara las fronteras de las posibilidades. Debo señalar que no se ha mencionado que nuestro conflicto estaba bastante complicado por los conflictos que afectaban a la región, Guatemala, Nicaragua, y es bien importante también que teníamos en medio el enfrentamiento ideológico de las superpotencias. Esto fue una experiencia bastante grande para nosotros. La oportunidad real de llegar a dos sociedades unidas para colaborar en el avance mediante.
It looks like we may have lost the general. I'm hoping he'll be able to kind of rejoin us. CJ, can you work with him, or Shannon, could you work with him? I'm not sure if we may have to get him to come back. While we're waiting for, technology is great when it works, and obviously it's always frustrating. So can I ask Shannon and CJ and Ariana, can you all help the general kind of turn off the computer and come back, and we see if we can sort that out? While we're waiting for that, why don't I turn to Ambassador Patterson? Okay, General.
Aquellos factores pertinentes a la situación. Nosotros comprendimos que la política de la paz era parte del juego de poder. Hacer la guerra es una tarea militar, hacer la paz era una tarea política. Esto fue bastante duro comprenderlo para poderlo desarrollar. Tampoco es el simple consenso de tener la razón en algo. Es bien importante entender que tienen que existir las negociaciones, tanto horizontales como verticales. La de la mesa más la de la sociedad en su conjunto y de la misma comunidad internacional. La posibilidad de la paz no se va a agotar en ningún momento en función de las razones que tengan unos o que tengan otros. Tuvimos que aclarar también el concepto de paz y pasar de una visión de paz simple como ausencia del conflicto a la paz con justicia y democracia, que son elementos que están comprendidos dentro del acuerdo propio de Chapultepec. Porque se requieren, como decía la embajadora Patterson, transformaciones sociales, económicas, y en este sentido de la negociación tuvimos un problema bastante fuerte en determinar quién iba primero, si las transformaciones o la ausencia del conflicto como elemento primario. Nosotros caminamos por crear las condiciones de la paz con armonía que nos permitiera ingresar posteriormente a los cambios sociales, económicos e institucionales. En la negociación se construyó la democracia. Nuestros acuerdos fueron una reforma al sistema político que así estaban determinados. Y también debemos de comprender que ellos no fueron diseñados bajo ningún momento para ser cumplidos de modo automático. Naciones Unidas ingresó muy bien y apoyó para definir a través de maniobras políticas y arduas negociaciones todos los factores que surgían en la construcción. Debo de concretar bastante bien que lo que he visto hacia el futuro ha sido que confundimos mucho los acuerdos de paz con la construcción de la paz. Y esto debe quedar bastante claro y separarlo. Sí doy las lecciones que las planteaba Rubén de una manera, es que en nuevos procesos Naciones Unidas debe de ayudar a fortalecer los mecanismos internos de consenso mientras se ofrece las necesarias verificaciones y no dejar de mencionar la importancia y el valor de la diplomacia multilateral como valor fundamental. Debo afirmarles ahora que El Salvador es totalmente un país diferente al anterior y que luego vamos a analizar algo otras cosas o a contestar las preguntas que tengan. Me quedaría en estos elementos señalados para la consideración de ustedes.
Me encantó. Gracias, mi general. Let me start with Ambassador Patterson. Ambassador Patterson, you mentioned that there's the role for the international community and the United Nations in Afghanistan, but that sometimes creates some friction between the current government and the international community. Could you talk about how we might manage that friction? How should we think about managing that friction, Ambassador Patterson? And maybe Ambassador DeSoto might have some views on this also.
So I would say that the government sort of has to get over that because I don't see any other role. I don't see any other organization that could play the necessary role in Afghanistan. There are no relevant regional organizations with that kind of clout. And to go further, the UN and the Security Council are going to be vastly more important in Afghanistan than they were in El Salvador, because you're going to need the support of the 5 permanent members, if only because of geography. And it's not just up to people like Ambassador DeSoto. They've got to have the support of the whole UN system in this. And that means WHO, it means UNDP, it means a whole range of activities that have to be mobilized to move this forward. So I just don't think there's any other option to do this other than the large UN system, which of course has its faults, but I don't think there's any alternative.
Ambassador Soto, would you want to comment on this?
I don't believe I have anything to add to what Ambassador Patterson has said. I totally agree with her.
Ambassador Soto, while I have you, how do you build trust? What are the tools that a third party can do to kind of, what were the sort of things that you did? Some of them you've talked about, but talk a little bit more about the sort of tools that you use, because obviously having an able and effective third party interlocutor mattered in El Salvador. What were some additional tools that you used?
Well, the first thing is to listen a lot and to have the patience to listen a lot. And first and foremost, of course, the negotiators themselves, with whom I spent a lot of time separately. I don't count almost the times that they were meeting together, but also during my visits to San Salvador, and there were about 35 or 36 during the 22-month negotiations, I listened widely, not just to government people, but also to social and political leaders, people like Rubén Zamora, who I always saw when I went to San Salvador, and whose lucidity was matched by that of no one. And I would try to hear what it is that people were concerned with. And that taught us very early on that you couldn't get away with some sort of quick fix in San Salvador, not just because of the correlation of forces, but also because it was necessary to get the country back on its feet again and in a position once transformed to carry out the necessary reforms. But since you've asked me, I think I should come back to the question that you asked Ann Patterson, and it is that what you have now, I think, in the UN system is a much better integrated body of agencies than you had back in our times, when some of us, the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions, for instance, were acting at cross purposes, which created a lot of difficulties and blocked a lot of the funding. But for that, what you need to do is to be plugged into the system and to keep people abreast of what you are doing while preserving the confidentiality of the negotiations, which is a circle difficult to square.
Okay, I'll come back. This is fabulous. Oh, actually, let me take advantage, Ambassador DeSoto. Okay, so if you were the Secretary General today, I mean, I keep thinking what we need is somebody who is the equivalent of an ordained minister that's Sunni Muslim, who's also a former foreign minister and has UN cred. Is there someone like this that's got religious credibility, UN credibility, and is someone like an Alvaro de Soto? Who's the Ambassador DeSoto with all these sort of credibility that we could put forward? Can you come up with a couple names that we ought to suggest?
I think I'd better just leave that to the Secretary General. I'm sure that he has a modern equivalent of a Rolodex, and he is very well plugged into the international system. He knows what he's doing.
Very diplomatic of you, Ambassador. So think about that, and maybe at the end we might ask for some names of folks. And Ambassador Patterson, think about if you were advising the Secretary General, who would you put forward as some potential names? Is there someone from Bangladesh? Is there somebody from Nigeria? For example, the president of the Central Bank of Nigeria, the former president of the Central Bank, happens to also be a Sunni Muslim cleric and sort of this very interesting international figure. I don't know, maybe it's someone like him. Anyway, so I just put that out there as someone to think who the person could be, because it seems to me the person has to be someone with a unique set of skills. I don't know, Ambassador DeSoto, you want to react to that?
Well, I wouldn't. I say, is the requirement really sort of a religious affinity? The reason I ask for this is that in my time, the United Nations had a sort of a policy that you took people from as far away as possible, so that there could not be even the slightest suspicion that there was any sort of a leaning in one way or another. Now, I was a bit of an exception in that, as Ruben Zamora was recalling, the idea of the UN being chosen as the third party or facilitator or mediator was somewhat controversial in the region. And there was a preference for resorting to the regional organization. As it happened, for the first time ever, you had a Secretary General who was a Latin American. And it was important, I think, for the parties that whoever was doing this on behalf of the Secretary General should be someone close to the Secretary General. But I wouldn't necessarily think as a first choice of someone from the region.
Okay. Can I just push I want to have you, because I'm so pleased you're with us, Ambassador. So I'm Catholic. I'm not, it's not something that people talk about at think tanks in Washington. I think we're in an increasingly secular age. I think the issue of religion is an important dimension in this conversation in Afghanistan. It's really a central dimension. Could you talk about the role of the Catholic Church, that both either the Vatican or locally, that it played in the peace process, Ambassador Soto?
Well, let's say what is interesting is that when President Cristiani, in his inaugural speech, called for what he called a permanent dialogue with the FMLN on 1 June 1989, it was the church that leapt into action and called a meeting. But in the event, as things developed, it was the UN who was, and specifically the Secretary General, who had been very much in touch with the leaders in the region, and threw me in touch with the FMLN, that was asked to take over. And this was not a problem for the Catholic Church at the time. It was not something that, let's say, the Curia was particularly interested to my knowledge. As I understand it, the church by and large thinks in centuries, which is something that I once heard in the Vatican. Qui pensiamo in secoli, as I said. But in the immediate, I mean, I think that they were content and fairly confident with the Secretary General's experience and stature.
Thank you. Okay, let me turn to Embajador Zamora y General Vargas. ¿Cómo puede ser sobre el tema de cómo se puede existir excombatientes? How can there be coexistence among former combatants, given sort of this deep differences in ideology and hate and this violence, this violent past where people keep score? How do you get beyond that? So Ambassador Zamora, you first, please, and then General Vargas.
Okay. Mira, esto es una experiencia que poco se ha explorado en el caso salvadoreño, porque prácticamente después de al llegar a los acuerdos de paz pusieron juntos a los excombatientes de los dos lados, los de la Fuerza Armada y los de la guerrilla, como diciendo, bueno, ustedes son los que han peleado, ahora acuérpense. La experiencia que tenemos es que ha sido muy exitosa. Los problemas de los excombatientes no es que no trabajen juntos, sino que trabajan un montón de grupos. Pero en cada grupo usted encuentra del ex-FMLN, o bueno, son ahora en partido, ¿verdad? Y de los que habían sido soldados de la Fuerza Armada e incluso cabos y, o sea, los grados más bajos. Yo le digo, mi experiencia por andar hablando y dando charlas acerca de eso, el sábado andaba dando una, era que la gran era para excombatientes y la mayoría eran del FMLN, pero había un 20%, me dijeron, yo no los conté, de la Fuerza Armada, pues ex soldados. O sea que yo creo que fue que ya había cansancio, y este es un elemento importante, un cansancio en ambos bandos. ¿Ya? Yo no sé mucho de la Fuerza Armada, pero de la FMLN sí lo conocía porque éramos aliados en ese momento, y efectivamente ellos, los mismos comandantes, me reconocían que había cansancio ya en parte de la gente. No se diga entre las personas, el pueblo en general, ¿ya? O sea, el fenómeno del cansancio en una guerra que no es regular, ¿ah?, sino que es irregular totalmente, guerra de guerrillas, con un span de 12 años, ¿sí?, eso genera cansancio en la población y en los mismos combatientes. O sea, habían condiciones ya que creo que se pudieron aprovechar con esa idea que se planteó de una cierta igualdad entre las dos fuerzas militares, dijéramos, ¿verdad? En el tratamiento que se le iba a dar a los excombatientes.
Okay. General Vargas, ¿cómo se maneja esto? Mute, señor, mi general. General Vargas, the mute.
Ya ahorita estoy. Yo tengo otra visión complementaria a la de Rubén. Yo personalmente, que estuve los 12 años en el conflicto, que fui herido 3 veces en combate, lo primero que llegó a mi mente es cómo el conflicto va deshumanizando a las personas y eso había que pararlo. Eso no podía continuar. Adicionalmente, creo que hubo una convicción propia en la cual es mejor hablarnos que ignorarnos y es mejor coexistir que matarnos. Llegamos, era un poco bastante complejo, porque lo que nace en el curso del conflicto es la convicción de la voluntad nacional. Ahí va bien que los militares entendieran la negociación que la misma gente del FMLN. Tuvimos que llegar a aspectos claros en los cuales se los mencioné al principio de mis experiencias, fue que hacerle la parte del conflicto es de implementación técnica de la Fuerza Armada, pero la implementación de la paz era del conductor político del Estado. Y tanto la comandancia del FMLN como el presidente Cristiani tuvieron el suficiente liderazgo de llevarnos hacia ese punto. Esto nos lleva a establecer una relación de trabajo donde vamos a abordar la dinámica y los problemas sin necesidad de continuar con más muertes en El Salvador.
Okay. Gracias. Okay. I want to ask Ambassador De Soto, could you talk about how do we get parties to commit and stay committed, Ambassador De Soto?
Well, what we did is from the start, tried to put the parties, as it were, on stage. For instance, in late February of 1990, we had hammered out the essentials of the first agreement that was reached, which was essentially procedural, but of course, substance has a funny way of, seeping through the interstices of procedure. But I said to both parties, this is not good enough. This was a confidential meeting that was held in a hotel in Mexico. I said, I want both sides to have a high-level delegation in Geneva on a certain date at which I knew that I could get the Secretary General to be there. So like that, every time there was an agreement, I made sure that this was widely divulged And so that, let's say, the political standing and the honor of both sides in a certain way was being exposed. This is what you're agreeing to, and you're agreeing to it under the auspices of the United Nations. So you are here on the stage where the UN Security Council, in whose lap this will eventually fall, will be monitoring you. So this is essentially what we could do. They were political agreements, but we tried to surround it with as much solemnity as possible.
Thank you. Ambassador Patterson, I want to go back to something you said earlier. I agree with you that you have to look at the El Salvador case as a success. You've had multi-party democracy, peaceful democratic transitions. You've had moments of made significant and real economic progress when folks like Dr. Daboob was, helping lead. It was at the economic helm of the country. So, so there have been moments of real progress in El Salvador. And I would argue that the peace process was a success. But it seems to me that you also alluded to some of the kind of, let's call them some of the challenges that were sort of either not able to be addressed or sort of that were kind of either that have been kind of remainders that may be issues that are going to be with Afghanistan. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I believe, Ambassador Rahmani, there are 400,000 young people that enter the labor market every year in Afghanistan. It's one of the fastest growing societies in the world. I think El Salvador has had is still a little bit. It's not as rapidly growing a society. There is a youth bulge in El Salvador. There is an enormous, massive youth bulge in Afghanistan. And this issue of meeting the jobs challenge is enormous. So the first thing is about jobs and youth in El Salvador. The second is the issue of migration that you mentioned earlier. I would like you to address this as well. What I say to Pakistan military officials, and I've been one of the few people in Washington that says anything nice about Pakistan. I've gone out of my way to say nice things about Pakistan. And so I've said to Pakistan military folks, is it a win for Pakistan if there's a total collapse of Afghanistan? You get 5 million new Afghan refugees. Is that a success for the government of Pakistan? And they all look at each other kind of nervous and say, well, maybe it's not such a success. So this issue of migration is a real issue, and it's been an issue in El Salvador. So could you talk about this issue of jobs, perhaps post-peace security, which you experienced and saw, and maybe there were some roles of some outside folks like the United States, and this issue of migration, because I think these are all related issues in Afghanistan as well. Ambassador Patterson, please.
So the first issue was the migration issue, which I think we on the US side totally underestimated. And as we all know, this has been both a curse and a blessing for El Salvador because it enabled an employment safety valve. If you come to the US, you earn in 33 days what you earn in a year in El Salvador. But there had been massive family breakdown in the 80s as people immigrated to the US. When I was there, we had 3 plane loads of deportees a week. And many of them were criminal aliens, and we kept no records. We just sort of opened the doors of the planes and they went off, and there were no charges against them in El Salvador. And a lot of this was the basis of what are now these terrible gangs that are both on the West Coast and in El Salvador. I think we did a lot to be proud of in El Salvador, the US, the political integration, judicial reform, assisting in Salvadorans in these, first-string Salvadorans in these, but the big problem was security. And that's where you get into the issue of the police and the job creation. There just wasn't enough thought given to personal security and other issues that I don't know if were considered at the time, like prison reform. That's become a huge issue in El Salvador, as the prisons certainly were. I think it's gotten better, have become just controlled by the gangs. So all these things played out into El Salvador, I think weren't well understood. They certainly weren't well understood even by '97, but they've become big issues now. But job creation this is true all over the Middle East and Afghanistan and Salvador, job creation for basically largely unskilled young men is hugely important.
Thanks, Ambassador President. I would reiterate this issue. We in essence took gang members who didn't know El Salvador and sent them to El Salvador with sort of limited support and said, here, these were sort of trained at the Harvard University of gang membership on the hard streets of LA or going to United States. And we didn't think this through. And then we have also, I think, as you will agree, Ambassador, we have an illicit drug consumption problem in this country. I'd like us to re-stigmatize drug consumption in this country, because a lot of the problems that continue to be a problem in El Salvador has been the degradation of the family in El Salvador, gangs, and our illicit drug consumption. So then we say, why are all these people coming, migrating from El Salvador to the United States? Well, some of it's on us. Some of it was we sent them. Some of it's our drug consumption, and then not being a good enough partner to help support kind of jobs and growth. There's a huge potential in El Salvador. Don't you agree, Ambassador Patterson? It's a country of great
potential. It wasn't that we didn't understand what these people coming back would do. It was not really that much different. So now Americans would say, well, why do we have these criminal aliens? Let's just send them home. So there was huge political impetus to get them out of the country. And the other phenomenon that I think is less well known is there were thousands upon thousands of young, when I was there, American citizens who'd been sent back by their parents to live with grandparents. And the minute they reached 16 or 18, no English skills, no job skills, they would head for the States too, to help out their families. They were American citizens, and they were prime recruiting fodder for gangs.
So, thank you. Ambassador Zamora, the National Reconciliation Law in El Salvador provided amnesty to former combatants on both sides of the conflict. What were the short and long-term impacts of this amnesty law? Based on your experience, how can Afghanistan strike their own balance between reconciliation and justice for their peace-building efforts? Ambassador Zamora.
Bueno, creo que yo lo tenía en mis notas, porque en eso estuve muy metido. En primer lugar, los acuerdos de paz no tocan el problema de la amnistía. No hay una palabra sobre amnistía allí, y es por una razón muy racional para la negociación. Era imposible juntar la posición de la Fuerza Armada con la posición de la guerrilla. La Fuerza Armada decía que quería una amnistía total y absoluta para como perdón y olvido, como decimos nosotros, para después. La guerrilla decía que ellos no tienen por qué tener amnistía si ellos no han cometido ningún delito, porque ellos estaban rebelados contra un gobierno que estaba contra los derechos humanos. Y ya en la Constitución estaba la cuestión de los derechos humanos como causa de rebelión del pueblo. O sea, era imposible. Y entonces eso se dejó para después. En los meses después de la negociación, ¿verdad? De que terminó la negociación y vino la parte de la firma y todo esto, se formó la comisión la comisión por la continuidad del acuerdo, que era una comisión ya nacional formada por 2 representantes de la Fuerza Armada, 2 representantes de la guerrilla, 2 representantes de cada uno de los partidos políticos que estaban en el Parlamento, y era presidida por el arzobispo de San Salvador. ¿Ya? Eso ya era nacional. Esa comisión, ¿ya?, fue la que tuvo que enfrentar el problema de la amnistía, y se logró un acuerdo de una amnistía parcial que daba amnistía, pero que tenía 2 excepciones. Una por razones jurídicas. Las personas que han sido ya condenadas por tribunal popular, o sea, del pueblo, de la sociedad, no se pueden tener amnistía. Y la otra era que todo aquel que fuera mencionado en la Comisión de la Verdad como responsable de crímenes importantes, tampoco se podía tener amnistía. Todos los demás quedaban amnistiados. O sea, ese fue el acuerdo que se logró, y se lo voy a decir ahora públicamente, Fue el acuerdo entre el presidente de Arena, que era el doctor, ¿cómo se llamaba? Ya se me olvidó cómo se llamaba, Armando, Armando, ¿verdad? Que después fue presidente, y un servidor de ustedes. Los dos nos apartamos porque éramos parte de la comisión y dijimos, esto hay que resolverlo y pongámoslo de esta manera. Ya. Y así fue, bueno, y ahí estaba el general, el general aquí presente, que era uno de los dos delegados de la Fuerza Armada. ¿Ya? Y así se aprobó eso. Esa ley fue la primera de la cuestión de amnistía. O sea, era una amnistía que tenía dos limitaciones, una por razones jurídicas y la otra por, bueno, y presión de Estados Unidos, porque ahí fue Estados Unidos la que metió presión a esa otra excepción, y la otra por la cuestión del asesinato de las religiosas, para decir por qué razón Estados Unidos lo hacía, el gobierno. Y la otra, pues, la del acuerdo de paz, que como íbamos a dar amnistiada, teniendo una comisión de paz, que era la que iba a decir quiénes es lo que habían cometido los delitos más grandes. Era un absurdo. Esa fue la cosa. Lo que pasa es que esa ley se aprobó por unanimidad de la Asamblea, la firmó el presidente Cristiani, pero cuando salió el discurso, ya el resumen, no el resumen, sino el documento de la Comisión de la Verdad traía nombres de quienes tenían responsabilidades. Que el presidente Cristiani trató que no tuviera nombres e incluso habló con el secretario general para que le dijera a la comisión de que no pusiera nombres de quienes eran responsables. Y la respuesta del secretario general fue decirle, mire señor, yo soy depositario de los acuerdos porque oficialmente es el depositario. Si aquí no vienen los dos que negociaron y enfrente de mí me dicen que lo haga, yo no puedo aceptar de decirle a la Comisión de la Verdad de que no pongan nombres. Por supuesto, no hubo acuerdo. Y por eso entonces vino la segunda ley de amnistía, que fue una ley absoluta de amnistía, ¿eh? Que ha durado por varios años, pero luego vino después la Sala de lo Constitucional de la Corte Suprema de Justicia y ha declarado inconstitucional esa ley, y que la que queda vigente es la primera ley, que era la que tenía pues los espacios. Esa ha sido la historia de la amnistía en mi país, porque todavía el problema de las masacres sigue haciéndose y presentándose ahora en el orden judicial, y que ya se puede tratar de alguna manera, porque ya pues se cambió la Sala de lo Constitucional, no la actual, sino la anterior, que eso era inconstitucional. Esa es la historia de la amnistía. Es muy complicado para el caso salvadoreño, y usted ve el caso colombiano, buscaron otra salida, y es una cosa complicadísima resolver el problema de las amnistías y juntarlo con el problema de las violaciones a los derechos humanos. O sea, yo estoy de acuerdo que no hay solución, y yo la única solución que encontré en ese momento fue esa de lograr una cosa intermedia para ver si se podía hacer algo. Y esa era aceptada por todo el mundo. Pero una vez la segunda ley no fue aceptada, por supuesto, por las víctimas, que siguieron, y todavía, ¿cuántos años después, verdad? Casi 30 años después, siguen empezando, y es parte de los conflictos entre el gobierno y el Poder Judicial, porque el Poder Judicial, en base a lo que dijo la Sala Constitucional, está abriendo los procesos, pero el Ejecutivo se niega a dar la información que tiene que dar sobre el caso. Es un caso, el caso del Mozote, que es la más grande de todas las masacres de la guerra.
Muchas gracias. Ambassador De Soto, do you want to add something? I have another question also for you, and maybe I could hear from Ambassador Zamora and General Vargas on this as well, but this is from my friend and colleague, Mark Schneider, who's a senior advisor at CSIS and has been a friend to El Salvador for decades. Was also been someone who's also, when he was at the International Crisis Group, worked on the Afghanistan file and was a very helpful collaborator on this. I'm grateful to you, Mark Schneider. Mark Schneider, how could a peace accord and post-peace in Afghanistan do a better job in establishing effective, independent, judicial, prosecutorial justice system that protects human rights and enforces the law, in addition to independent civilian police. So Ambassador DeSoto, let me start with you, and then Ambassador Zamora and General Vargas. Ambassador DeSoto, please.
The reason I asked to speak, Dan, is that I saw a question put by someone in the public with the question, how to deal with years of resentments between both sides. Almost everyone is armed and hurt by the other side in one or the other way. Forgive and accepting each other will be a very hard process. Now, this ties in with what Ruben Zamora was saying earlier. He alluded to the report of the Truth Commission in El Salvador. Now, the philosophy behind the Truth Commission in El Salvador was that, if I can encapsulate it in a single sentence, which I'd like to extract almost verbatim from the UN Secretary General's speech when he received the report of the Truth Commission, was that in certain cases, such as El Salvador, in order to put behind them the trauma of the past, a society needs to go through the catharsis of facing the truth about it, what actually happened. And this was agreed to by both sides, and both sides agreed to implement whatever recommendations the Truth Commission made. Now, Ruben Zamora has gone through the history of what happened. And I have to say that by the rejection, almost instantaneous and totally dismissive by the government of the report, almost the very moment it came out, it sort of truncated this process that the country, that El Salvador society could have gone through, should have gone through. Now, I am answering a question from someone in the audience. Each society has to reach its own conclusions about how it's going to reckon with the past. What I am suggesting is that if you simply turn over a new leaf and decide not to look back, it will, over time, have negative consequences and come back and bite you some way. And it could condemn you to a long period of polarizations. I'm not going to go into history, but countries that do manage to go through this process, which needs very sort of outstanding leadership, usually fare better. That's my answer to that particular question. And by the way, I fully agree with Mark Schneider's concerns, and I have great admiration for Mark's work over the years.
Let me suggest we turn to a last question, given sort of the time constraints. I would ask everyone to give me some closing thoughts. Ambassador Patterson, let me start with you. Then let me move to Ambassador Zamora, General Vargas, and then I'll give Ambassador DeSoto the last word. So Ambassador Patterson, please.
Thank you, Daniel. I'd just like to reiterate, I think, the basic point of this encounter, and I really compliment you on CSIS on this, which you've got to have broad international support for the peace process. You've got to have absolutely first-rate people on the ground implementing it, which is extremely important. And you've got to have sustained attention and sustained resources for it so it doesn't fall back. And I would conclude with that. Thank you.
Okay. Ambassador Zamora.
Bueno, en primer lugar, yo quisiera decir que perdonen, pero yo he estado insistiendo más en las debilidades o en los malos pasos que hemos dado, porque yo soy un convencido que lo que más podemos ayudar a un país que quiere hacer un proceso no es decirle lo bonito que hicimos o lo bueno que hicimos, porque a saber si les va a servir, pero sí decirle dónde nos hemos quedado cortos, lo que nos ha faltado para que ellos lo tomen en consideración en su proceso. Creo yo que ese es un papel que es importante que juguemos ahora los que ya pasamos por esa experiencia. Yo nada más lo que quisiera decirle a la embajadora es que lo que ustedes no pueden perder nunca es la esperanza que van a salir de los problemas que han tenido. Si ustedes pierden la esperanza, lo han perdido todo, embajador.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. General Vargas, please.
Gracias. Primero, gracias por la invitación y luego concluiría con algunos aspectos importantes. Yo me he referido más al enfoque de las visiones propias para poder entrar en la propia negociación y correr sobre ella. El grado de tolerancia a las soluciones políticas negociadas es un factor clave que debe de tener en esas futuras negociaciones. Es decir, en Afganistán no lo podemos hacer desde la mesa. Tienen que haber negociaciones verticales y horizontales que concurran realmente a una voluntad nacional de paz. Adicionalmente, el mandato a Naciones Unidas tiene que ser lo más claro posible. En nuestro caso, dejó algunos factores oscuros que luego tuvimos que irlos arreglando en el camino. ¿Y cuál es el activo papel que Naciones Unidas va a tener para una solución duradera? No es menos importante que el papel que contribuye a la salida de las crisis en el logro de la negociación e implementación, necesitan de ese tercero que nos lo dé. Y la experiencia más dura para El Salvador fue que la comunidad internacional fue muy generosa para la guerra, pero fue bastante corta para la paz. Y esto nos generó los problemas en el desarrollo de la democracia, que es la construcción de la paz, con las limitaciones que ha tenido nuestro país. Estos son factores que deberían de tenerse en cuenta, independientemente que puedan existir muchos otros más.
Thank you, General. Ambassador de Soto, please.
Let me say, perhaps I should say this in Spanish. Quisiera decir que suscribo lo que acaban de decir tanto Rubén Zamora como Mauricio Vargas, como el general Vargas, que me parece sumamente importante, sea quien sea, que sea responsable como tercera parte, que no sé si lo habrá en el caso de Afganistán, tenga la capacidad de congregar a todas las fuerzas entendidas, a todas las fuerzas interesadas. Me preocupa una diferencia muy importante en el caso de Afganistán con respecto de El Salvador, y es el hecho de que hay por lo menos 3 miembros permanentes del Consejo de Seguridad que tienen mucho interés en el desenlace de Afganistán, por lo menos 3. Y hay una tendencia recientemente a que no se permita a las Naciones Unidas que actúe con la independencia, con la que es necesario que lo haga. Y hay una tendencia digamos, a desautorizar un poco a las Naciones Unidas. Me refiero sobre todo al papel que desempeñan en, por ejemplo, Libia y Yemen, donde el representante de Naciones Unidas tiene un cierto mandato, pero que ese mandato no es respetado por algunas potencias y algunos miembros permanentes del Consejo de Seguridad. Y me estoy refiriendo sobre todo al caso de Libia. Y en Afganistán, me temo que en esta situación que se ha formado, donde aparecen rivalidades a la tercera parte, al representante de las Naciones Unidas, que eso puede complicar enormemente la tarea. Y por eso tiene tanta importancia que haya un claro entendimiento de que si hay una persona nombrada con la autoridad del secretario general y bajo el mandato del Consejo de Seguridad, si esa es la vía que se escoge, pues es importantísimo que este sea respetado. Y si no hay un claro compromiso en ese sentido, y si el secretario general pidiera mi consejo, yo le diría, mejor no tomar este encargo. Gracias.
I think what we need is a doer who's a listener, and like you, a doer and a listener with ties to the Secretary General, and not a big talker. You're obviously you're an articulate person, but you're an active listener. So we need someone like, where is the next Alvaro de Soto with Afghan cred? I think that's the question. Let me just say one other, so I think that's an important question. So the second thing is, I think peace is possible in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a fabulous country. It's fascinating. It's got the potential for agriculture, specialized agriculture. It's got enormous tourism potential. There's this fabulous book by James Michener, which is a bit dated, about the 1940s in Afghanistan, called Caravans. I recommend it highly. Wonderful book. It's a wonderful country. And I agree that it's, in theory, it's geographically quite an interesting place. And one of the things that this Afghan government has thought about is making Afghanistan's geography a plus, not a minus. And they're right. So I think there's a lot. I also think Afghanistan could be a part of a Central Asian future. Central Asia is changing, and Afghanistan needs to be part of the future of Central Asia. There's this fabulous book by Fred Starr called Lost Enlightenment, which would tell you, and I couldn't put the book down, that Afghanistan and Central Asia was the center of all knowledge and advanced learning and scholarship in the Middle Ages, more than any other place in the world. It's unbelievable. Fascinating. And so there's a lot to build on, and has fabulous natural resources. There's a book by my friend Alex Degan about the natural resources, the flora and fauna of Afghanistan, and that might be a unifying potential. So I'll just say peace is possible. I thank all of you for doing this. I want to turn the floor over to my very good friend, Ambassador Rahmani, to make any closing remarks.
Thank you so much. It was absolutely incredible. Thank you. I want to just thank all the panelists for their enthusiasm, for their interest, and for their willingness to very openly share their own expertise. It leaves me with a lot of questions, and I think that it's a good thing, because there are all these things that probably I haven't thought about, and along myself, many of my colleagues who are engaged in these issues, and we need to think about. That's why we wouldn't need to reinvent the wheel and spend the energy on some of the things that has been already done, and some of the points that you and your expertise come and clarify, bring and clarify for us, and we take it on. So there is a lot for us to take on, and I just want to thank you for your contribution at this very critical time for my country, to end a 40-year-long war, which unfortunately has its own life and has become somewhat a mode of life. But our people want nothing more than peace, and the peace that would be dignified and respectful for all of our citizens, and would preserve the very gains that we have all made together. And these are massive gains that we have achieved over the past 20 years with the help of our partners, with the United States at top of the list. So having said that, you are contributing to a very important process that hopefully will set the course for a better future for our very young population and for generations to come. I thank you all.
Thank you, Ambassador Rahmani. Let me thank again Linnea, Sandin, and Shannon for all their very hard work on this report and pulling this together. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Team CSIS. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Ambassador Rahmani. We're at your disposal. Thank you all.